Hello, I'm Shaurya Thapa of Borrowing Tape, and today I'm joined with Eli Craig, who is the director and co-writer of the new Shudder original, the slasher horror Clown in a Cornfield. Our listeners who are into horror would also remember Eli Craig as the director behind Tucker and Dale versus Evil, which is, by the way, one of the funniest movies I have watched. So, welcome, Eli, and it's a pleasure having you on the podcast.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
My first question for you, Eli, is that your film is also based on a novel called Clown in a Cornfield, which is about a killer clown terrorizing a small town, making the locals fight amongst themselves, that kind of stuff. Now, this is the first movie in a career when you don't rely on an original story. Like as per what I know, that Tucker and Dale versus Evil and Little Evil were both based on your original concepts. So how was the experience of adapting a novel for a film this time?
I really enjoyed adapting this book. I mean, in part because it was such a great sandbox to play in, and it had all of the elements that I could use sort of to tell the story in the way I'd want to. But I'm always kind of looking for guardrails, like rules in a story, and how do you minimize in a way, like when you're looking at the page and you're writing and it's just this blank page, how do you give yourself a direction and some guardrails so you don't completely just spin off into nowhere land? And adapting really helps you do that. Say when I'm writing Tucker and Dale versus Evil or whatever, you're always coming up with these rules that, like, it has to, Tucker and Dale was like, it has to look like a kill from the kid's side, or there there's rules in writing that actually focus you. So I don't find adaptation all that different from coming up with a story yourself, except for me, you're really trying to satisfy those fans too and stay true to the ethos of the book, while also adding like these cinematic elements that may heighten the movie experience of it a bit.
So apart from the book, did any horror or non-horror films inspire Clown in a Cornfield?
I kind of think of my because I grew up watching a lot of horror films and a lot of action films and also comedies, and I think of they're all kind of live within a soup in my brain or like a bouillabaisse, and sometimes I'm borrowing from things I don't even know I am, but certainly always borrowing from like the tropes that that all the horror movies had in like the 80s and 90s. Um, I mean, just looking at like I was looking a lot at the old slasher 80 films, like, Friday the 13th and Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Halloween and, of course, Nightmare on Elm Street. And of course, the newer sort of more sarcastic or uh, versions of like, Scream
Yeah.
affected me a lot. And then also looking at like Jaws and you'll be surprised probably to know, like, I literally was like watching Terminator 2 and thinking of like that here, like, okay, it's kind of like a nonstop villain that just is relentlessly coming for someone over and over and over, kind of like those James Cameron movies and Aliens. And so it's so many movies that I like kind of take from and put into a place where it could just be its own thing.
Yeah. Talking about like old influences like 80s and 90s, the lead character in your film, when she comes to this town, she asks other teenagers, other high schoolers, it feels like this town is still stuck in the 90s.
Mm.
And the locals, they kind of give her this vibe that it maybe is still stuck in the past, because a major theme in this film for me was fighting tradition. Because
Mhm.
here we have a quote unquote redneck town, a tightly knit community, but your heroes are these rebellious, bratty students, who want to reject this tradition. And they're also very Gen Z, so they are, on social media, they're making YouTube horror videos, colorful bunch of characters. Were there any challenges in writing such young Gen Z characters for you?
Yeah, because I'm not young Gen Z.
Yeah,
Yes, but that's part of the fun of it. I also have an 18-year-old son now. He's 17 at the time I was making this. That has a very sharp sense, like he has alarm bells that go off if something seems false to him. So I did find myself reading the script a lot to him, and in the editing bay showing him scenes and being like, what about this? What about this? Um, I really wanted it to come across as like authentically Gen Z because I do feel like sometimes you have these older writers like plugging words in young people's mouths and it just doesn't seem like the stuff they would actually be saying.
Yeah,
And so it was important to me that it just feels like it doesn't strain itself to try to make this like Gen Z dialogue seem different. But one thing about like this generational divide that you're bringing up is that young people growing up in a small town in America now, they all have access to the same stuff on the internet, and they're all there's much more of like a community of young people in the world that just they understand what's going on all over.
yeah,
And it's they're not so isolated as maybe they once were. And so these kids, when Quinn Maybrook shows up to the small town of Kettle Springs, they kind of surprise her with uh, how cool they are. And she's
yeah.
from Philadelphia and feels like she's going to be the one that just got more awareness to like the big city and stuff, but she's kind of not. She fits in with them quite quickly.
Yeah. And so, like, my takeaway from this was that your 18-year-old son was like a testing audience, like the
Always.
pre-release testing audience. But uh, coming back to the fact, like, when I mentioned that Tucker and Dale was versus Evil was your first film, and that still remains like a cult film. It has quite a dedicated fan base. But do you feel any pressure? Like, Clown in a Cornfield is your third feature film now. So do you feel any pressure of your first film being such a cult hit that, people like critics and audiences would tend to compare your new work with your first feature?
Well, I'm starting to feel a little more pressure now that you're comparing the two, or a lot of people are.
My
But
apologies for that.
of course, I feel pressure anytime I decide to make a movie. And like this is the thing I want to make, and it'll live with me forever. There's just a huge amount of pressure making a film, and especially an indie film where you don't have a lot of resources, and if you run out of money, they're not going to give you more. They're just going to shut down production. And it's a high stakes thing. But I will say, I very consciously wanted to make a film that was not trying to be Tucker and Dale. Um, I personally don't think I could do comedy horror again as well as I did Tucker and Dale. Like I came out of the gate from film school. I was so hungry to make my first movie, and I thought made the movie I wanted to make with Tucker and Dale. And unfortunately, it didn't take off. Like it took a long time for it to become this cult classic that it is now. And initially it sort of fell flat in movie theaters and I was devastated because I thought maybe I'm not right. Like maybe I'm crazy. Maybe people don't a lot of making a movie or doing anything artistic is like how do you relate to the audience and how are they going to experience this? And initially when like the audience didn't seem to gravitate toward it, I thought, well, maybe that's not gonna work.
Mm,
And then ultimately it came around to becoming what I always thought it would be, which is like this sort of cult classic that lives to me. I wanted to make the next Evil Dead 2 when I made Tucker and Dale. And it's strangely, Evil and Dead 2 wasn't like a success out of the gate, but it got there through video rentals, and this sort of got there through streaming. And so I'm just so grateful that people see in that film what I saw it when I was making it.
So my final question for you, Eli, is that as you just mentioned that, maybe like, you're going through a different territory now after Tucker and Dale. Because I assumed that Clown in a Cornfield would just be a horror comedy, but there was some like freaky jump scares in it, I'll admit. And the clown, Friendo the clown, he was really scary, especially for a viewer like me who is generally afraid of clowns. So, apart from Friendo, which other cinematic clown is your favorite or might be the scariest clown for you?
Well, I'm a big fan of like story and character, and I'm a big fan of like an underdog character kind of rising to the occasion and overcoming, and and even through like real horror, you know, getting that feeling of like hope. Um, so I don't know if it does sort of like it to me is not just one of the best clown horror movies of all time. The Andy Muschietti It
Yeah.
movie is like just just a profoundly wonderful horror movie. So I wanted to make sure I wasn't like trying to emulate any part of it or walking on it, that we were creating very much our own clown. Um, this is, it is so fantastical, and Pennywise is so magical. And Friendo is very kind of grounded and he's like a blue collar clown. And so I just I I knew I was playing in the sort of clown horror genre, but I'm thankful that it's a genre because people could say, oh, well, they're trying to be art, or they're trying to be Pennywise. And no, we're not trying to be any of those things. We're trying to be our own horror film with our own friendo clown that is quite distinct from any of those and will live within that clown horror genre.